The Missouri River swallowed her scream before anyone could hear it, dragging Tully's beneath the churning brown water as the spring current tore through the riverbank with merciless hunger. And in that frozen moment between breath and drowning, she understood that the prairie could give life as easily as it could steal it. Carson Chandler saw her only because his horse had stopped to drink, the animal's ears pricking forward at a sound that didn't belong to the wind or the water. And when he spotted the dark head bobbing in the rapids, arms flailing against the current that pulled her toward the rocky bend where the river turned savage, he didn't think, he simply moved. The water hit him like a fist of ice, stealing his breath as he kicked hard against the current, his boots heavy as anvils, his arms burning as he fought toward the girl, whose fingers clawed at the surface before vanishing again beneath the froth. And when his hand finally closed around her wrist, her skin was cold as death, her body limp and unresisting as he dragged her toward the muddy bank. He pulled her onto the grass with a grunt that was half prayer, half curse, rolling her onto her side as water poured from her mouth, her chest still, her lips blue, and for one terrible moment, Carson thought he was too late, that the river had already claimed her. But then she coughed, violent and choking, her body convulsing as she gasped for air. Her eyes flew open, wild and unfocused, black as river stones and filled with a terror so raw it struck him in the chest. And she tried to scramble backward, her hands slipping in the mud, her voice cracking as she gasped words he didn't understand, desperate sounds in a language that tumbled over each other like the water that had nearly killed her. Carson raised both hands slowly, deliberately, keeping his distance even as his instinct was to reach for her, to steady her, to tell her she was safe, but the fear in her eyes stopped him cold. And he spoke low and careful, the way he would to a spooked mar, his voice rough from the cold and the panic still hammering in his chest. "You're safe," he said, each word slow and clear. "Breathe, just breathe, you're on solid ground now." She stared at him, chest heaving, water streaming from her black braids that hung heavy down her shoulders, her buckskin dress clinging to her thin frame, torn at the shoulder where something, a branch or a rock, had ripped through the leather. And her hands, small and shaking, pressed against the earth as if testing whether it was real. Carson didn't move closer. He simply sat back on his heels, dripping and muddy, his hat lost somewhere in the river, his shirt plastered to his chest, and he waited, letting her see that he wasn't going to grab her, wasn't going to hurt her, that whatever terror lived behind those eyes, he wasn't part of it. Minutes passed, or maybe only seconds. Time felt strange in the aftermath of violence. And finally her breathing slowed, her shoulders loosening just slightly, though her gaze never left his face, studying him with the intensity of someone trying to decide if he was predator or protector. "Tullies," she whispered, the word barely audible, and she touched her chest with trembling fingers, repeating it, "Tullies." Carson nodded once, understanding, and tapped his own chest in return. "Carson," he said, "Carson Chandler." She repeated his name haltingly, the syllables unfamiliar on her tongue. And something in her expression shifted, not trust exactly, but the faintest easing of the terror that had gripped her moments before, as if giving her name and hearing his in return had created some small bridge between them. The sun hung low over the prairie, casting long golden light across the grassland that stretched endlessly in every direction. And Carson glanced toward the river, still swollen from the spring melt, still dangerous. And he wondered what had brought her here, what had driven her into water that could kill a grown man, let alone a girl who couldn't have weighed more than 100 pounds soaking wet. "Can you stand?" he asked, gesturing to his feet, then to her, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. And she watched him carefully before nodding once, her jaw set with determination that surprised him. She tried to push herself up, but her legs buckled immediately, still weak from the cold and the fight. And Carson moved without thinking, reaching out to catch her elbow, but she flinched so violently that he froze, his hand hovering in the air between them. "I won't hurt you," he said quietly. And he didn't know if she understood the words, but he hoped she could hear the truth in his tone, the sincerity that he poured into every syllable. Talise stared at his hand, then at his face, and slowly, so slowly it felt like watching ice melt. She gave the smallest nod, and Carson gently, carefully, placed his hand beneath her elbow, taking most of her weight as she found her footing on the slippery bank. She was taller than he'd first thought, her head coming nearly to his shoulder, and up close he could see the exhaustion carved into her features, the hollowness in her cheeks that spoke of days, maybe weeks without proper food, and bruises, faded but still visible, shadowed the skin along her collarbone where her dress had torn. Carson's jaw tightened, anger rising hot and sudden in his chest, not at her, but at whatever had put those marks there, at whatever had driven her to throw herself into a river that should have been her grave. His ranch house stood about 2 miles east, a solid structure of timber and stone that he'd built with his own hands over the past 5 years. And he glanced at his horse, still grazing peacefully near the water's edge, oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded. "I have a place nearby," Carson said, gesturing vaguely toward the eastern horizon. "Warm, dry, safe," he repeated the last word, hoping it would stick, hoping she would understand that whatever she was running from, she didn't have to run anymore. Talise followed his gesture, her dark eyes scanning the endless prairie as if searching for something, or perhaps checking to see if anyone was following. And when she looked back at him, there was a question in her expression, tentative and uncertain. Carson whistled low, and his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Rusty, lifted his head and trotted over with easy familiarity. And Carson kept one hand on Talise's elbow, steadying her as they moved slowly toward the horse. Rusty snorted softly, his large eyes curious as he studied the bedraggled girl. And Talise reached out with one tentative hand, her fingers brushing the horse's muzzle. And for the first time since Carson had pulled her from the river, something that might have been the ghost of a smile touched her lips. "He's gentle," Carson said, patting Rusty's neck. "Won't hurt you, I promise." He didn't know how much she understood, but he kept talking anyway, his voice low and steady, filling the silence with words that mattered less than the tone, the rhythm, the simple human sound of someone who meant no harm. Getting her onto the horse proved more difficult than he'd anticipated, her legs still weak, her movements stiff with cold and exhaustion. And finally Carson cupped his hands together, offering her a step up, and after a long moment of hesitation, she placed her small foot in his palms and let him boost her into the saddle. She sat rigidly, gripping the saddle horn with white-knuckled intensity, and Carson swung up behind her, careful to leave space between them, careful not to crowd her or make her feel trapped. And he picked up the reins and guided Rusty into an easy walk toward home. The prairie stretched around them, vast and open, under the enormous sky. And the only sounds were the steady rhythm of Rusty's hooves, the whisper of wind through the tall grass, and Talise's shallow breathing as she sat rigid in the saddle, her body tense as a drawn bowstring. Carson didn't speak during the ride. He simply kept Rusty moving at a steady pace, his own body aching from the cold river water, his clothes still dripping. But his mind was racing with questions he couldn't ask and wouldn't have understood the answers to even if he could. The sun had begun its descent toward the horizon when his ranch finally came into view, the house standing solid and square against the prairie, smoke rising from the chimney where he'd left a fire burning that morning, and the barn and corrals spread out behind it, empty now except for his 2 other horses and a handful of cattle grazing in the near pasture. Talise's grip on the saddle horn tightened as they approached, her head turning slightly as she took in the structures, the fences, the scattered tools and equipment that marked this as a working ranch, and Carson felt her tension increase, her breathing quickening. "It's all right," he murmured. "Just my place, nobody else here, just me." He guided Rusty to the front of the house and dismounted first, then reached up to help Talise down. And this time she didn't flinch when his hands closed around her waist, though her body remained stiff and unyielding until her feet touched solid ground. The front door stood slightly ajar, and Carson pushed it open wider, gesturing for her to enter. But Talise remained frozen on the threshold, her eyes darting from the dark interior to Carson's face and back again, as if weighing the danger of the unknown against the danger of staying outside. "Food," Carson said, miming eating. "Fire," he pointed to the smoke rising from the chimney. "Warm," he rubbed his arms as if trying to generate heat, and slowly, carefully. Talise took one step forward, then another, until she crossed the threshold into Carson Chandler's home. The interior was simple but well kept. A large main room with a stone fireplace along one wall, a sturdy wooden table with 4 mismatched chairs, a kitchen area with a cast-iron stove, and 2 doors leading to what Talise assumed were sleeping quarters, and everything was clean, organized. The space of a man who lived alone but took pride in his surroundings. The fire in the hearth had burned low, but Carson quickly added more wood, coaxing the flames back to life until warmth began to spread through the room. And he pulled one of the chairs closer to the fire and gestured for Talise to sit. She moved like a deer entering a clearing, every muscle ready to bolt. But she sank into the chair with a small sound that might have been relief. And Carson noticed the way her hands immediately stretched toward the flames, seeking heat after the river's brutal cold. He disappeared into one of the back rooms and returned with a thick wool blanket, which he draped carefully over her shoulders. And Talise clutched it with both hands, pulling it tight around herself. And for the first time since he'd pulled her from the water, Carson saw her shoulders drop slightly, some of the terrible tension easing from her frame. "I'll make coffee," he said, moving to the stove, "and food you need to eat." He worked quietly, efficiently, filling the kettle and setting it on the stove, pulling out bread and dried meat from his stores, slicing an apple he'd been saving, arranging everything on a plate that he set on the table within her reach. Talise stared at the food with an expression Carson couldn't quite read, hunger and hesitation warring in her dark eyes. And finally she reached out with one trembling hand and took a small piece of bread, bringing it to her mouth and chewing slowly, as if she'd forgotten what eating felt like. Carson poured coffee into 2 tin cups when the kettle boiled, and he set one in front of her before taking the chair on the opposite side of the table, deliberately putting distance between them, giving her space to breathe, to think, to realize that she wasn't a prisoner here. "Talise," he said quietly. And she looked up at him. "You're safe here. I don't know what you're running from, but you're safe now." She studied his face for a long moment, those dark eyes searching for deception, for threat, for any sign that his words were lies. And whatever she saw there must have satisfied something in her, because she gave the smallest nod and returned her attention to the food, eating with more confidence now, her hunger finally overcoming her fear. Outside the windows, darkness had settled completely over the prairie, the stars emerging one by one in the vast expanse of sky. And inside the ranch house the fire crackled and popped, filling the room with warmth and the comforting smell of burning wood. Carson rose and lit 2 oil lamps, their soft glow pushing back the shadows. And when he returned to the table, he found Talise watching him with an expression that was less fearful now, more curious, as if she was beginning to see him as something other than a threat. "You can sleep in there," he said after a while, pointing to one of the back rooms. "It's got a bed, a door that locks from the inside." He made a turning motion with his hand, hoping she'd understand that she could secure herself away from him if she wanted. Talise followed his gesture, her gaze lingering on the closed door. And something flickered across her face, relief perhaps, Or maybe just exhaustion finally catching up to her now that her body had decided she might actually survive the night. Carson stood slowly, moving to the door and pushing it open so she could see inside. A simple room with a bed covered in quilts his mother had made years ago. A small table with a lamp, a window that looked out over the eastern pasture. And nothing threatening, nothing that should make her afraid. She rose from her chair with effort, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. And she moved toward the doorway with hesitant steps, pausing at the threshold to look back at him. And Carson saw the question in her eyes, even if she couldn't speak it. "I'll be out here," he said, gesturing to the main room. "By the fire, if you need anything. Just call out." Talais nodded once, slowly. And then she stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. And Carson heard the soft click of the lock sliding into place. And instead of feeling offended, he felt relieved that she was taking precautions, that she was protecting herself even here. He added another log to the fire and settled into the chair she'd vacated, still warm from her body. And he stared into the flames while his mind raced with everything that had happened. The impossible chance that had put him at that exact spot on the river, at that exact moment. The terror in her eyes, the bruises on her skin. The way she'd looked at him when he'd promised she was safe. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Carson dozed in fits and starts, his body aching from the cold water and the hard chair, his ears attuned to any sound from the back room, listening for signs of distress, for nightmares, for anything that might mean she needed help. But Talais remained quiet throughout the long night, either sleeping peacefully or simply lying awake in the darkness, processing everything that had brought her to this strange place, this unexpected sanctuary in the home of a man whose name she'd only learned hours ago. Dawn broke cold and clear across the prairie, the sun rising like fire over the endless grass, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. And Carson woke to find his fire had died to embers and his body stiff as old leather from sleeping in the chair. He rose with a groan and rekindled the flames, adding kindling until they caught and spread. And then he put coffee on to boil and began preparing breakfast, slicing bacon thick and cracking eggs into a bowl, moving through the familiar routine with mechanical precision while his thoughts kept drifting to the closed bedroom door. He was setting plates on the table when he heard the lock turn, and Talais emerged from the bedroom looking somehow smaller in the morning light. Her hair still damp and tangled from the river, her dress dried but stiff with mud. And she stopped just outside the doorway as if unsure whether she was allowed to enter the main room. "Morning," Carson said quietly, his voice still rough from sleep. And he gestured to the table. "Sit. Breakfast is almost ready." She moved to the chair she'd occupied the night before. And Carson noticed the way she positioned herself, so she could see both the front door and the bedroom door, never putting her back to an exit, always maintaining an escape route. And the realization made his chest tight with an emotion he couldn't quite name. He cooked in silence, the bacon sizzling in the cast iron skillet, the eggs turning golden at the edges, and when he set a full plate in front of her, Talais stared at it with wide eyes as if she couldn't quite believe the abundance before her. "Eat," Carson said gently, taking his own plate to the chair across from her. "You'll need your strength." She ate slowly this time, not with the desperate hunger of last night, but with something closer to appreciation, savoring each bite as if committing it to memory. And Carson found himself watching the way morning light from the window caught in her black hair, turning it almost blue in places when she'd finished. She set down her fork and touched her chest, looking directly at him. "Thank you," she said, the English words careful and deliberate, shaped with effort. Carson blinked in surprise. "You speak English, little," Talais replied, holding her thumb and forefinger close together to show how much mission school before, and her expression darkened at whatever memory the words had conjured. Shadows passing behind her eyes, Carson leaned forward slightly. keeping his voice gentle and his hands visible on the table. "What happened to you, Talise? Why were you in the river?" Her jaw tightened. And for a long moment she said nothing, her gaze dropping to her empty plate, her fingers curling into fists on the table. And Carson was about to tell her she didn't have to answer when words began to spill out. Halting and broken, English mixed with Lakota, her voice shaking with the weight of what she was sharing. Traders had come through her village 3 weeks ago. White men with whiskey and rifles and empty promises. And when her father had refused to trade horses for their inferior goods, they'd grown angry, threatening, making it clear that refusal was an insult they wouldn't forget. They'd waited until dark, until the village slept. And they'd come for her specifically, stealing her from her family's lodge while her parents and younger brother dreamed peacefully. Binding her wrists and gagging her mouth with rough cloth that tasted of tobacco and dirt. She'd been thrown into a wagon and driven east, away from everything she knew. And when the traders had reached a settlement 2 days later, they'd sold her to a man who ran a saloon, telling him she'd make a good worker if he could break her spirit properly. The saloon owner had tried, keeping her locked in a back room, bringing her out only to clean floors and wash dishes, striking her when she moved too slowly or looked at him with too much defiance in her eyes. And the bruises Carson had seen were only the visible evidence of cruelty that went deeper than skin. But the saloon owner had made a mistake. He'd underestimated her. Assumed that because she was young and alone, she would eventually submit. And when he'd left her unguarded for just a moment, distracted by a fight breaking out in the main room, she'd run. She'd stolen a horse from behind the building and ridden west as fast as the animal would carry her, riding through the night with no plan except to put as much distance as possible between herself and that terrible place. The horse had eventually thrown her near the river, spooked by a rattlesnake she hadn't seen in the dark. And she'd been on foot for nearly 2 days, hiding during daylight, moving at night, drinking from streams and eating nothing because she didn't dare stop long enough to forage. When she'd heard horses behind her that morning, heard men's voices calling out in English, she'd panicked, certain they'd come to drag her back. And the river had seemed like her only option, her only escape. Better to drown than to return to that hell. Better die than go back, she whispered. And the finality in her voice made Carson's blood run cold. He sat very still, his hands flat on the table, his jaw so tight it ached. And rage burned through him like wildfire, hot and consuming, directed at men he'd never met, but would gladly destroy if given the chance. "You're not going back," he said, and his voice came out harder than he'd intended. "I don't care who comes looking, you're under my protection now. And nobody's taking you anywhere you don't want to go." Talise looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. And something in her expression cracked open. Some wall she'd been holding in place since the moment he'd pulled her from the water. "Why you help me?" she asked, her voice breaking on the words. "You not know me, I bring danger maybe. Why you care?" Carson met her gaze and held it, letting her see the truth written plainly on his face. "Because it's right," he said simply. "Because you needed help and I was there. Because no one deserves what happened to you, and because," he paused, searching for words that felt too big and too honest. "Because I know what it's like to feel alone in the world." The silence that fell between them was different now, heavier with shared understanding, with the beginning of something that felt like trust. And outside the window, the prairie stretched endlessly under the morning sun, vast and beautiful and indifferent to the small human dramas playing out in isolated ranch houses. But inside Carson Chandler's home, something had shifted. Something fragile and precious had been planted, and neither of them yet understood how deeply it would grow. 3 days passed like slow water finding its course through stone. And in that time the ranch became something neither Carson nor Talise had expected. Not quite a home yet, but no longer a place of strangers either. The morning of the fourth day dawned with a softness that felt almost apologetic, as if the prairie itself was trying to make amends for the violence of the river. And Carson woke to find Talais already awake, sitting by the window in the main room, watching the sun climb over the eastern horizon. She'd found one of his old shirts hanging on a peg by the door, and she wore it over her torn buckskin dress, the fabric swallowing her small frame, but providing warmth against the cool morning air. And when she heard him stirring, she turned with an expression that was less guarded than it had been the day before. "Morning," Carson said, moving to the stove to start coffee. And Talais nodded in response, her fingers tracing patterns on the windowsill, drawing shapes that might have been letters or symbols from a language Carson couldn't read. He'd spent the previous evening cleaning her buckskin dress as best he could, scrubbing away the river mud and hanging it near the fire to dry, and now it lay folded on the table, still bearing the tear at the shoulder, but at least no longer stiff with dried silt. "I can fix that," Carson said, gesturing to the torn leather. "Not pretty maybe, but it'll hold." Talais looked at the dress, then at him, surprise flickering across her face. "You sew?" "Had to learn," Carson replied with a slight shrug. "Living alone out here, you either learn to fix things yourself or you go without. My mother taught me the basics before she passed." Something softened in Talais' expression at the mention of his mother, and she picked up the dress, running her fingers over the torn section. "I can fix," she said quietly, "if you have." She struggled for the English word, finally miming a sewing motion. "Needle and thread," Carson finished, and he retrieved his sewing kit from a drawer, a small tin box containing needles of various sizes, spools of thread in different colors, and a leather thimble worn smooth from use. Talais took the kit with careful hands, examining the contents with the focused attention of someone who understood the value of such tools. And she selected a needle and thread that closely matched the color of her dress. Threading it with practiced ease, Carson watched as she worked, her fingers moving with swift precision, creating stitches so small and tight they were nearly invisible. And he realized this was something she'd done countless times before, a skill passed down through generations of women in her tribe. "You're good at that," he observed. And Talais glanced up with the faintest hint of pride in her eyes. "My mother teach me," she said, her voice carrying a weight of longing. "She teach me many things, sewing, cooking, making medicine from plants." She paused, her hands stilling on the leather. "I miss her." Carson felt the ache in those words, understood it in a way that needed no translation. "How long since you've seen your family?" 3 weeks, Talais whispered. "But feel like 3 years. I don't know if they look for me still, or if they think I am dead." The thought sat heavy between them. And Carson poured 2 cups of coffee, setting one beside her on the table. "They're looking," he said with certainty he didn't entirely feel but offered anyway. "A family doesn't stop looking for their daughter." Talais wrapped her hands around the warm cup, drawing comfort from its heat. "The traders, they go far. Maybe too far for my father to follow. And winter coming soon, my people must move to winter camp. Cannot search forever." Carson understood the reality she was describing, the harsh practicality of survival on the plains, where resources were precious and winter was unforgiving. But he also understood something else, that Talais was preparing herself for the possibility that she might never see her family again. "We'll find a way," he said, though he had no clear plan yet. "Once you're stronger, once we know you're safe, we'll figure out how to get word to your people, let them know you're alive." Hope flickered in her eyes, fragile and uncertain. "You would do this, help me find them?" "Yes," Carson said simply, and the word carried the weight of a promise. The morning stretched into afternoon, and Carson found himself teaching Talais English words while they worked around the ranch, pointing to objects and speaking their names slowly, waiting while she repeated them back with careful concentration. "Horse," he said, gesturing to Rusty who stood in the corral. And Talais echoed, horse, then added, "We call Zunxio Weatherwing, means sacred dog." Carson tried the Lakota word, stumbling over the unfamiliar sounds. And Talais laughed for the first time since he'd known her. A sound so unexpected and genuine that it stopped him mid-motion. And he found himself smiling in response. "Your language is hard," he admitted, and Talisa's smile widened slightly. "English also hard," she countered. "Too many words sound same but mean different things."
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
And spelling, she shook her head in mock frustration. Spelling make no sense. They continued like this throughout the day. Carson teaching her words like water, fire, bread, sky. And Talais offering their Lakota equivalents, creating a bridge between their worlds one word at a time. By evening, Carson had shown her on the ranch properly. The barn where he kept feed and tools, the small vegetable garden he'd planted behind the house, the creek that ran along the southern property line, clear and gentle. Nothing like the angry Missouri that had nearly claimed her. Talais stood at the creek's edge, watching water flow over smooth stones. And Carson noticed her shoulders tense, her breathing quicken. "You all right?" he asked quietly. "Water still scare me," she admitted, her voice barely audible over the creek's gentle murmur. "I see it, and I remember drowning, remember cannot breathe, cannot see. Only cold and dark." Carson stepped beside her, not touching but close enough that she could feel his presence. "Solid and grounding. That'll take time to fade," he said. "Fear like that doesn't leave easy. But it will leave eventually. You have fear like this?" Talais asked, turning to look at him. Carson was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the moving water. "I have dreams sometimes," he said finally. "About the war, about things I saw and things I did. And when I wake up, I'm back there for a few seconds. Can't remember where I am or when I am," he paused, "but then I remember I'm here. I'm home, and it passes." Talais studied his profile, seeing something in his expression that she recognized. A kinship of wounds that went deeper than skin. "You fight in war?" "3 years, Carson replied. "Joined up when I was 18, thought it'd be an adventure. Came home when I was 21 and knew better." "War changed people," Talais said softly, and it wasn't a question. "Yes," Carson agreed, "it does." They stood together by the creek as evening shadows lengthened across the prairie. Two people marked by different violences, but understanding each other in a way that needed no elaborate explanation. That night, Talais didn't immediately retreat to the bedroom after dinner. Instead, she sat by the fire while Carson worked on repairing a bridle that had cracked, the leather worn thin from years of use. "Can I ask you something?" Talais said, her English coming more smoothly now with each passing day. "Of course," Carson replied, not looking up from his work. "Why you live alone out here? No wife, no family nearby?" Carson's hands stilled on the leather, and for a moment, Talais thought perhaps she'd overstepped, asked something too personal. But then he set the bridle aside and leaned back in his chair. "I was engaged once," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Girl named Sarah from back east. We were going to get married when I returned from the war. Had it all planned out. What happened?" Talais asked gently. "I happened," Carson said with bitter honesty. "I came back different, harder, had nightmares that woke her up screaming. Couldn't be around crowds without feeling like I needed to fight or run. And Sarah, she tried to understand, tried to help. But eventually she realized she'd been waiting for a man who didn't exist anymore. She left." Talis's voice carried sympathy rather than judgment. "She gave me back the ring," Carson said. "Told me she loved who I'd been, but couldn't live with who I'd become. And she was right to do it. I wasn't fit for married life then. Maybe still aren't. So you come here to be alone. Bought this land with money I'd saved, built the house myself. Figured if I couldn't fit into civilization anymore, I'd just make my own place outside of it. Carson looked at her directly now. Been here 5 years, and until 4 days ago, I'd convinced myself I preferred the solitude. Talise understood what he was saying, what he was carefully not saying, and now? Carson held her gaze. Now I'm not so sure. The fire crackled between them, filling the silence with its ancient voice. And something unspoken passed between them. Acknowledgement of a connection neither had sought, but both were beginning to recognize. I should sleep, Talise said finally, rising from her chair. But she paused before heading to the bedroom. Carson, thank you for everything, for saving me, for giving me place to heal, for not asking me to be anything other than what I am. You don't have to thank me, Carson said quietly. Just get strong again, that's thanks enough. She smiled, small but genuine, and disappeared into the bedroom, leaving Carson alone with the fire and thoughts he wasn't quite ready to examine too closely. The following morning brought unexpected visitors. Carson was mending a section of fence when he spotted 2 riders approaching from the south, and his gut immediately tightened with protective instinct. He hurried back to the house where Talise was grinding herbs she'd gathered near the creek. Using a mortar and pestle Carson had retrieved from storage. Get inside, he said, keeping his voice calm but firm. We have company, might be nothing, but stay out of sight until I know who they are. Talice's eyes widened, fear flashing across her face. But she moved quickly into the bedroom, and Carson heard the lock click as he stepped outside to meet the approaching riders. They were ranchers from a spread about 15 miles west. Carson recognized them from a cattle auction he'd attended the previous fall. Sam Porter and his hired hand whose name Carson couldn't recall. Chandler, Sam called out in greeting as they drew close. Hope we're not intruding, just making rounds. Checking if anyone's seen strangers passing through. Carson kept his expression neutral. What kind of strangers? 3 men, rough types, been asking around the settlements about a Lakota girl, claiming she stole a horse from them and they want her back. Sam shifted in his saddle, clearly uncomfortable, offering a reward. $50 to anyone who can tell them where she is. Carson's blood ran cold, but he kept his face carefully blank. Lot of prairie out here. Person could disappear pretty easy if they wanted to. Why they think she came this direction? They tracked her to the Missouri, figure she either drowned or crossed over. Either way they seem real determined to find her. Sam paused. Between you and me, something about their story doesn't sit right. Men that angry over a stolen horse usually just cut their losses and move on. These 3, they got a mean look about them. I'll keep an eye out, Carson said. If I see anything unusual, I'll send word. Sam nodded. Appreciate it, also wanted to warn you. They're telling folks the girl is dangerous. Violent, but, he glanced at his hired hand. Then back to Carson. My wife thinks the whole thing smells wrong. Thinks maybe these men are the dangerous ones, and the girl was running for good reason. Your wife sounds like a smart woman, Carson said carefully. That she is, Sam agreed, gathering his reins. Anyway, you see anything, you know where to find us in Chandler. If by chance you do come across a young Lakota woman, might be better to help her stay hidden than to hand her over to men offering reward money. Some things are worth more than $50. Carson met Sam's knowing look and gave a slight nod, understanding passing between them without explicit words. I'll remember that. The 2 riders departed, and Carson waited until they'd disappeared over the southern rise before returning to the house. He found Talise pressed against the bedroom door, her face pale, her hands shaking. They're looking for me, she whispered. They not give up. No, Carson agreed, they haven't. But they're not going to find you either. Sam Porter's a good man. He's not going to tell them anything, even if he suspects you're here. And this ranch is isolated enough that most folks don't have reason to come by. But they know I come this way, they keep looking, eventually. Eventually isn't today, Carson interrupted gently, and between now and eventually. We figure out a plan, maybe get word to your people. Maybe find a way to move you somewhere safer. But right now, you're here and you're protected. That's what matters. Talus's shoulders sagged with exhaustion that wasn't physical. I bring you trouble. I should leave, go somewhere you not have to lie for me. You're not bringing me anything I can't handle, Carson said firmly. And you're not leaving until you're ready and it's safe. I meant what I said before, you're under my protection now. And that means something to me, even if it doesn't mean much to the world. She looked at him with an expression so full of conflicting emotions that Carson couldn't parse them all. Gratitude and fear and something else. Something softer that neither of them was ready to name. Why you do this? She asked, the same question she'd posed before, but carrying different weight now. You could give me to them. Collect money, have no more worry. Carson stepped closer. Not touching her but near enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. Because I look at you and I see someone who's been hurt enough, he said, his voice low and intense. And I'm tired of living in a world where people think $50 is worth more than another person's life. So no, I'm not giving you to them. I'm not collecting their blood money. And I'm not going to apologize for choosing to be decent when decent seems to be in short supply. Tears gathered in Talus's eyes, threatening to spill over. And she pressed her hand to her chest, over her heart. I will never forget this, she whispered. What you do for me, I never forget. Then don't forget to stay alive, Carson said. That's all I'm asking. Just stay alive and get strong enough to reclaim your life. Whatever shape that takes, she nodded, blinking back tears. And Carson turned away to give her privacy to compose herself. But he felt the weight of her gratitude like a physical thing. Warm and heavy and somehow more valuable than any reward money could ever be. That evening they sat together by the fire again. But the easy companionship from the night before had been replaced with tension. Both of them aware now that danger wasn't theoretical. It was three men riding somewhere on the prairie. Searching, determined, unwilling to let their prize escape. Carson cleaned his rifle methodically, checking the action, counting his ammunition, preparing for a confrontation he hoped wouldn't come, but knew might be inevitable. Talus watched him with solemn eyes, understanding what the preparations meant. If they come here, you will fight them? If they come here, Carson said without looking up from his work, they'll have to go through me to get to you. And I promise you, that won't be easy for them. I don't want you hurt because of me. Then we'll just have to make sure nobody gets hurt, Carson replied, finally meeting her gaze. I'm not planning on dying anytime soon. And I'm definitely not planning on letting them take you. So we'll figure it out together. The word hung in the air between them, carrying implications neither was quite ready to examine. But both understood instinctively, outside. Night settled over the prairie like a blanket. Stars emerging in their thousands, and somewhere in that vast darkness, three men continued their search. But inside Carson Chandler's ranch house, two people sat together by firelight, building something fragile and precious out of trust and necessity. And the simple human need to not be alone in the face of cruelty. And for tonight at least, they were safe, they were together, and that was enough. A week had passed since Sam Porter's warning, and the ranch had settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal, as if the threat hovering somewhere beyond the horizon was nothing more than a distant storm that might never arrive. Carson woke before dawn as always, but now he found himself listening for sounds from the other room. The soft rustle of Talais moving about, the quiet patting of her feet on the wooden floor. And he realized he'd grown accustomed to her presence in a way that both comforted and unsettled him. She emerged from the bedroom wearing the buckskin dress she'd repaired. her hair braided in the traditional Lakota style. And she moved to the kitchen area with a confidence that hadn't been there a week ago. Reaching for the coffee pot before Carson could get to it. "I make today," she said. And there was something in her voice that told him this wasn't a request, but a declaration of independence, a small reclaiming of agency. Carson stepped back, nodding. "I won't argue with that. My coffee's strong enough to strip paint anyway." Talise smiled as she worked, measuring grounds with careful precision. And Carson sat at the table, watching her move through his kitchen with increasing familiarity, rearranging things to suit her own logic, creating order where he'd only maintained function. "You've been thinking," Carson observed, recognizing the distant look in her eyes, "about what comes next." Talise didn't answer immediately. She poured water into the pot and set it on the stove before turning to face him. "I cannot hide here forever," she said quietly. "Winter coming soon, maybe 2 months. And when snow falls, travel become impossible." "So you want to try reaching your people before then," Carson said. Understanding where her thoughts had led. "My father. He will take our family to winter grounds near the Black Hills. They leave soon if not already gone." Talise's voice carried a weight of longing mixed with practical resignation. "If I don't reach them before they move, I wait until spring, maybe longer." Carson leaned back in his chair. "Considering the implications, the Black Hills are 4, maybe 5 days' ride north from here. Longer if we're trying to stay off main trails and avoid attention. We?" Talise repeated, her eyebrows lifting in surprise. "You think I'm letting you ride into Lakota territory alone with 3 men hunting you?" Carson shook his head firmly. "If you're going, I'm going with you. At least until you're safely back with your people." "That is dangerous for you," Talise protested. "White man riding into Lakota lands, some warriors might not ask questions first. Especially now with tensions growing between our peoples." "I'll take that risk," Carson said simply. "Besides, you'll be there to explain I'm not a threat. That should count for something." Talise studied him with an intensity that made Carson shift uncomfortably in his chair. "Why you keep doing this, risking yourself for someone you barely know?" Carson had asked himself the same question countless times over the past week, and the answer that kept surfacing was one he wasn't entirely ready to speak aloud. But Talise's direct gaze demanded honesty. "Maybe at first it was just you doing the right thing," he said slowly. "Pulling you from the river, giving you shelter, that was simple decency. But now," he paused, searching for words that felt true without revealing too much. "Now it's because I care what happens to you. Because these past days having you here have reminded me what it feels like to not be alone. And maybe I'm not ready for that feeling to end just yet." The coffee pot began to boil, steam rising in a thin column, but neither of them moved. Both caught in the weight of what had just been acknowledged between them. "I feel this too," Talise whispered finally. "This not being alone. It feels," she struggled for the English word, settling on, "important. Like maybe the river brought me here for reason beyond just surviving." Carson stood abruptly, the moment feeling too large and too fragile. And he moved to the window, staring out at the prairie that stretched endlessly under the morning sun. "We should start planning the journey north," he said, his voice rougher than intended. "Figure out what supplies we'll need. What route makes the most sense." Talise recognized the deflection for what it was. A necessary retreat from emotions neither of them knew how to navigate. And she let him have it, turning her attention back to the coffee that needed pouring. They spent the morning preparing, Carson pulling out maps he'd collected over the years. Crude hand-drawn things that showed approximate locations of settlements, water sources, and known Lakota territories. "Your people winter here?" he asked, pointing to an area west of the Black Hills. Talise leaned over the map, her shoulder brushing against his. And Carson felt the contact like electricity. "Yes, near Pahasapa. The heart of our sacred lands, my father's band." They stay in the sheltered valleys where pine trees grow thick and game is plentiful. And these areas, Carson indicated several marks on the map. These are places we should avoid? White settlements, trading posts. Anywhere the men hunting me might have people watching. Talais traced a different route with her finger. If we go this way, through the open prairie first, then north along the Cheyenne River, we avoid most settlements and stay in lands my people know well. Carson studied the route she'd outlined, mentally calculating distances and potential dangers. That's rough country, especially this time of year with early storms possible, but you're right. It's our best chance of avoiding unwanted attention. They worked through the details, discussing how much food to pack, which horses to take, whether to travel during day or night, and with each decision, Carson felt the reality of their impending departure settling over him like a weight. Once they left the relative safety of the ranch, they'd be exposed, vulnerable to both the men hunting Talais and the general dangers of frontier travel. But more than that, once they reached her people and she was safely home, this strange interlude would end and Carson would return to his isolated existence. The thought sat heavy in his chest, heavier than he wanted to examine too closely. That afternoon, Carson took Talais to the small meadow behind the barn where he'd been training a young mare. The horse was green but gentle, and he thought perhaps Talais would benefit from time spent with an animal that demanded attention but offered simple, uncomplicated affection. Talais approached the mare with the confident familiarity of someone raised around horses. Her movements fluid and assured, and the young horse responded immediately, lowering her head to accept Talais's touch. "She likes you," Carson observed, leaning against the fence rail. "Horses know who understands them," Talais replied, running her hands along the mare's neck. "This one, she is young, still learning what it means to trust people." "Not unlike someone else I know," Carson said with a slight smile. Talais glanced at him, catching the gentle teasing in his tone. "You say I don't trust?" "I'm saying you're learning to," Carson clarified. "Same as this mare, you're figuring out that not every person who approaches means harm. That sometimes safety is real and not just a temporary illusion." Talais was quiet for a moment, her hands stilling on the mare's coat. "In the mission school, they taught us that trust was weakness, that we must always be vigilant, always ready to protect ourselves." She looked at Carson directly. "But you make me think maybe they were wrong. Maybe trust is not weakness. Maybe it is the only thing that makes surviving worth the effort." Carson felt something tighten in his chest, an ache that was part longing and part fear. "I think your people probably have their own wisdom about trust. One that doesn't come from mission school teachers who never understood what they were trying to change." "Yes," Talais agreed. "My grandmother. She used to say that trust is like fire. It must be tended carefully, fed slowly, but once it burns strong, it can warm an entire lodge." She paused. "I think maybe between us, we are building this fire." Carson didn't trust himself to respond, so he simply nodded. And they stood together in companionable silence while the mare dozed between them. And overhead the sun tracked its slow arc across the enormous sky. Evening brought unexpected rain, not the violent storm that had swollen the Missouri, but a steady, soaking rain that drummed against the roof and turned the prairie into a silvered expanse. And Carson and Talais found themselves confined to the cabin, the outside world reduced to the sound of water and the flickering glow of lamplight. "Tell me about the war," Talais said suddenly. And Carson looked up from the saddle he'd been oiling, surprised by the request. "That's not a happy story," he warned. "I don't ask for happy," Talais replied. "I ask for true. You know my pain, my running, my fear. I want to know yours." Carson set aside the saddle and leather oil, accepting that she wouldn't let this go. "I was at Shiloh," he said finally, "a battle in Tennessee. 2 days of fighting that felt like 2 years, and when it was over, there were so many dead we couldn't count them all. Just piled them in trenches and covered them with dirt. Talais listened without interruption, her dark eyes reflecting lamplight. I killed men there, Carson continued, his voice flat with the weight of old guilt. Boys, really. Some of them couldn't have been more than 16, and I watched friends die. Good men who'd joined up thinking they were fighting for something noble. And by the end, we were all just trying to survive one more day. You carry this always, Talais observed, in your eyes, in the way you move. Like soldier who never stopped fighting. Some wars don't end just because the shooting stops, Carson said. I came home and everyone wanted to celebrate, wanted to hear heroic stories. But all I had were nightmares and a sense that I'd left the best parts of myself buried in those Tennessee fields. But you're not broken, Talais said firmly. You hurt, yes, damaged, yes, but not broken. I know broken. I see it in the eyes of warriors who return from raids changed by what they have done. You are not like them. You still have, she searched for the word. You still have heart that feels, that cares. Broken people cannot care anymore. Carson felt something shift inside him at her words. A small loosening of guilt he'd carried, for so long it had become part of his identity. You see things clearly, he said quietly. Pain teaches clarity, Talais replied, when you suffer. You learn to recognize truth because lies hurt too much to maintain. The rain continued its steady rhythm. And they sat together in the warm cabin while outside the prairie drank deeply, storing water against the dry times ahead. What will you do? Talais asked after a while. After you take me to my people, after you return here alone? The question struck Carson unexpectedly, forcing him to confront something he'd been avoiding. I don't know, he admitted. A week ago, I would have said I'd go back to my routine. My solitude, my careful isolation, but now, he gestured vaguely, encompassing the cabin, her presence, everything that had changed. Now I'm not sure that life is going to feel the same anymore. Because you will miss me, Talais said, not a question but a statement. Yes, Carson agreed simply. I will miss you. I'll miss having someone to talk to, someone who understands that being damaged doesn't mean being worthless. I'll miss the sound of your voice in the morning and the way you've made this empty house feel less empty. Talais stood and moved to where Carson sat, and with deliberate slowness, as if approaching a skittish animal, she reached out and placed her hand over his. I will miss you too, she said softly. I will miss feeling safe, miss learning English words. Miss the way you look at me like I am person worth protecting instead of property to be claimed. Carson turned his hand over, his fingers closing gently around hers. And they stayed like that for a long moment, hands joined, hearts beginning to acknowledge what their minds still resisted naming. When I return to my people, Talais said eventually, they will ask me many questions, where I have been, what happened to me, how I survived, and what will you tell them? Carson asked. I will tell them about the river, Talais said, and about the cattleman who pulled me from the water and gave me shelter and asked nothing in return except that I heal. She paused, her thumb tracing small circles on the back of his hand. And I will tell them that sometimes safety comes from unexpected places, and that not all white men are enemies, and that maybe, if we are very lucky, we find people who see us as we truly are instead of what they want us to be. Carson felt the sting of tears threatening, an unfamiliar sensation that caught him off guard. You're stronger than you think, he said roughly. Stronger than those men who tried to break you. Stronger than the river that tried to claim you. Strong enough to survive everything that's been thrown at you and still have the courage to trust again. I learned this strength from you, Talais said. From watching how you live, alone but not defeated. How you build life here with your hands and your will. You show me that surviving is not same as living, but with effort, with courage. Surviving can become living. The rain began to ease, its drumming rhythm slowing to a gentle patter, and somewhere in the distance, Thunder rolled across the prairie like a departing giant. And inside the cabin, two people sat together in lamplight, holding hands and speaking truths that felt too large for the small space between them. "We leave in 3 days," Carson said finally. "That gives us time to prepare properly, pack supplies, rest the horses, and make sure we're ready for whatever comes." Tales nodded. 3 days. And then we ride north, back to my people, back to the life I thought I had lost forever. "And I bring you home," Carson added. "I give you back to your family." And then, he couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't articulate what came after. "And then we see," Tales finished gently. "We see what paths the spirits have laid before us. We see if this fire we build is meant to warm only these few weeks, or if it burns strong enough to last through winter and beyond." Carson squeezed her hand gently before releasing it, needing distance to process the emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "I should check the horses," he said, standing abruptly.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
"Make sure the barn roof isn't leaking with all this rain." Tales let him go without protest, understanding that some feelings needed space to breathe before they could be fully acknowledged. And she watched him pull on his coat and step out into the diminishing rain, a solitary figure moving through the damp evening. She remained by the fire, staring into the flames, thinking about family and home and the unexpected gift of finding safety in the arms of a stranger who had become something more. Something she didn't have words for in either English or Lakota. Outside, Carson stood in the barn doorway watching rain fall in silver sheets, his hands shaking slightly from the intensity of what had just passed between them. And he realized with startling clarity that somewhere between pulling Tales from the Missouri and this rain-soaked evening, he had fallen into something deeper than gratitude or compassion. He had fallen into the kind of caring that changed a person, that made solitude feel like exile rather than choice, that made the future uncertain in ways both terrifying and exhilarating. The rain stopped completely just as full darkness fell, and Carson returned to the cabin to find Tales had prepared a simple meal, and they ate together in comfortable silence, both aware that time was running short, that in 3 days everything would change again, and neither quite ready to face what that change might mean. That night, as Tales prepared to retire to the bedroom, she paused at the doorway and looked back at Carson. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For today, for listening, for holding my hand, for making me feel like person instead of problem." "You've never been a problem," Carson replied. "From the moment I pulled you from that river. You've been," he searched for the right word, "you've been a gift, maybe when I didn't know I needed. But a gift nonetheless." Tales smiled, the expression lighting her entire face, and then she disappeared into the bedroom, leaving Carson alone with the dying fire and thoughts that would keep him awake long into the night. 3 days, he thought, 3 days, and then everything changes. And he wasn't sure whether he was more afraid of the journey ahead or of the emptiness that would follow once it ended. But for tonight, she was here, safe under his roof. And that would have to be enough. The morning of their departure arrived cold and clear, frost glittering on the prairie grass like scattered diamonds. And Carson loaded the final supplies onto the pack horse, while Tales stood in the doorway of the cabin, taking one last look at the place that had become her sanctuary. She wore her repaired buckskin dress under one of Carson's heavy coats, the sleeves rolled up several times to accommodate her smaller frame, and her hair was braided tightly in the manner of Lakota women preparing for travel, practical and neat. Nothing that would catch on branches or obscure her vision. "Ready?" Carson asked, leading Rusty and the young Mare toward the house, both animals saddled and provisioned for the long journey north. Tales turned away from the cabin, her expression resolute despite the uncertainty that shadowed her eyes. "Yes, I am ready, ready to go home." They mounted up as the sun broke fully over the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. And Carson took one final look at his ranch, the house he'd built with his own hands, the corrals and barn that represented 5 years of solitary labor. And he wondered if he'd return to find it unchanged, or if something fundamental would be different. The first day of travel passed without incident. They rode north across open prairie, following game trails and dry creek beds, staying away from established roads where they might encounter other travelers. And Tallis proved to be an excellent rider, moving with her horse rather than against it, reading the land with an intuition that came from a lifetime of living close to the earth. Carson watched her throughout the day, noticing how she seemed to grow more animated the farther north they traveled, as if proximity to her homeland was restoring something essential that captivity had stolen. And he felt both joy at her increasing vitality and a growing heaviness in his chest at what their journey's end would mean. They made camp that evening in a shallow draw that offered protection from the wind, and while Carson tended the horses, Tallis gathered dried grass and arranged their fire with an efficiency that spoke of extensive practice. And soon flames crackled cheerfully, pushing back the gathering darkness. "You're different out here," Carson observed, settling beside the fire with his tin cup of coffee. "More yourself, maybe less guarded," Tallis smiled, stirring the pot of beans and salt pork she'd set over the flames. "The prairie is my home. The mission school tried to teach us that open land was empty. Wasteland, but they were wrong. This land is alive, full of spirits and memories and the voices of my ancestors. Out here I can hear them again." "What do they say?" Carson asked quietly. "They say I am on the right path," Tallis replied, her eyes distant. "They say the river was meant to bring me to you, and you were meant to bring me home, and that everything happens according to a plan larger than our small understanding." Carson wanted to ask if the spirit said anything about what came after, if there was guidance for the tangle of feelings that grew more complicated with each passing hour. But he held his tongue. Some questions had no answers that words could provide. The second day brought clouds rolling in from the northwest, heavy and gray, carrying the smell of approaching rain. And they pushed the horses harder, hoping to cover more ground before the weather turned truly foul. By mid-afternoon, the rain began, light at first, then building to a steady downpour that soaked through their coats and turned the prairie into slippery mud. And Carson called a halt in a stand of cottonwoods that offered minimal shelter but was better than nothing. They huddled under the trees, water dripping from leaves and running in rivulets down the trunks. And Tallis moved close to Carson, seeking warmth rather than propriety. And he wrapped his arm around her shoulders without thinking, pulling her against his side. "This reminds me of the day I pulled you from the river," Carson said. "Watching rain hammer the prairie. You were soaked through just like this, shaking with cold and fear. But I am not afraid now," Tallis said, tilting her head back to look at him. "Because I am not alone, because you are here, and because I trust that we will reach my people safely." Carson tightened his arm around her. "I won't let anything happen to you. I promise, whatever comes, we face it together." The rain continued for hours, forcing them to make camp early in conditions that were far from ideal. But Carson managed to get a fire started using dry tinder he'd packed specifically for such circumstances. And they sat close to the flames, trying to dry their clothes while night fell around them. "Tell me about your family," Carson said, needing conversation to distract from the cold and wet. "Your father, your mother, what are they like?" Talis's face softened at the mention of her family. "My father, Macbialuda, his name means red cloud in your language. He is strong, respected among our people, a warrior who has counted many coups but also a man of wisdom who prefers talking to fighting when possible." "He'll be glad to have you back," Carson observed. "Yes, but he will also be angry," Tallis admitted. "Angry at himself for not protecting me, angry at the traitors who took me, angry at a world where his daughter can be stolen and sold like property. His anger will be a storm, but underneath it will be relief and love. And your mother? Wichipi Waste. Her name means good star woman. Talisa's voice grew thick with emotion. She is gentle where my father is fierce, patient where he is quick to act. She taught me medicine, how to read the plants and understand what the earth provides. She will cry when she sees me, and then she will feed me until I cannot eat another bite. And then she will hold me while I sleep and sing the song she sang when I was small. Carson heard the longing in her voice, the deep ache of a daughter separated from her mother. You'll be with them soon, he said, maybe 3 more days at most. Depending on weather and how quickly we can travel. 3 more days, Talise repeated. And Carson couldn't quite read the emotion in her voice. Whether she was eager for reunion or reluctant to have this journey end, the 3rd day dawned gray but dry. And they made good progress across terrain that was gradually becoming more rugged. Rolling prairie giving way to broken hills and scattered pine forests. And Talise grew increasingly alert, reading signs in the landscape that Carson couldn't see. We are close to Lakota lands now, she said around midday, pointing to markings on a cottonwood tree that looked like random scratches to Carson, but clearly meant something to her. These signs, they tell travelers which direction is safe, which paths lead to water. My people have been this way recently. Maybe hunting party or scouts. Carson felt his hand drift toward the rifle secured to his saddle. Not from aggression, but from an instinctive wariness that came from being unfamiliar territory. Will they be friendly when they find us? If I am with you, yes, Talise assured him. I will explain everything. They will see I come willingly. That you helped me. They will not harm you. And the men hunting you, Carson asked, any sign they've followed us this far? Talise had been watching their back trail constantly, her eyes scanning the horizon for movement. I see nothing. Maybe they give up. Or maybe they search in wrong direction. Or maybe, she paused, unwilling to voice the alternative. Or maybe they're better at tracking than we hoped. Carson finished grimly. We stay alert, keep moving, and hope we reach your people before anyone else finds us. They pushed on into the afternoon, the landscape growing increasingly beautiful as pine-covered hills rose around them and clear streams cut through valleys. And Carson understood why this land was sacred to the Lakota. It possessed a wild beauty that stirred something primal in the soul. It was late afternoon when they spotted the riders. 3 figures on horseback, silhouetted against the western sky. And Carson's hand moved automatically to his rifle before Talise grabbed his arm. Wait, she said urgently. These are not the men hunting me. These are Lakota warriors. I recognize the way they sit their horses. If you draw your weapon, they will see it as threat. Carson forced his hand away from the rifle, trusting Talise's judgment even as every instinct screamed at him to be ready for violence. And the 3 riders approached cautiously, their own weapons visible but not raised. Talise urged her horse forward, calling out in Lakota, her voice carrying across the distance. And one of the warriors responded, his tone sharp with questions. And a rapid exchange followed that Carson couldn't understand, but could read in body language and tone. Finally, Talise turned back to Carson and gestured for him to approach. It is safe. They know me. One of them is cousin to my father. They have been searching for weeks. They thought I was dead. Carson rode forward slowly, hands visible and away from weapons, and 3 Lakota warriors studied him with expressions that ranged from suspicious to openly hostile. And the eldest, a man perhaps 40 years old with a scar across his cheek, spoke in heavily accented English. You are the white man who kept our daughter safe? He asked, and there was challenge in his voice, as if he couldn't quite believe that any white man would help a Lakota woman without ulterior motive. I pulled her from the Missouri River, Carson replied carefully. She was drowning. I gave her shelter while she healed. And now I'm bringing her home. That's all. The warrior's eyes narrowed. That is all? You want nothing in return? No payment, no favor, no claim on her? I want her to be safe with her family, Carson said firmly. Nothing more. The warrior studied him for a long moment, then spoke to Tales in Lakota. A question that made her face flush and her eyes drop, and she answered quietly. And whatever she said seemed to satisfy the warrior because his expression softened slightly. I am Tatanka Natsan, Standing Buffalo, the warrior said. Tales says you are man of honor, that you protected her when others would have harmed her. For this, you have my gratitude and my people's gratitude. I don't need gratitude, Carson said. I just need to know she be safe. She will be, Standing Buffalo assured him. We take her to her family now. They will rejoice to see her alive. And you, he paused, considering. You are welcome in our camp, as guest as friend. This is rare gift we offer to white men. Do not waste it with foolishness. Carson nodded, understanding both the honor and the warning implicit in the invitation. I'll be on my best behavior. They rode together toward the Lakota camp. Tales positioned between Carson and the warriors, and she turned occasionally to look at him, her expression unreadable. And Carson wondered what she was thinking, whether she was happy to be nearly home or conflicted about what that homecoming would mean for what had grown between them. The camp appeared as they crested a hill, a collection of perhaps 30 lodges spread along a stream in a sheltered valley. Smoke rising from cook fires, children playing between the tipis, women working on hides stretched on frames, and the everyday sounds of a community living in rhythm with the land. Their arrival was noticed immediately, and people began to emerge from lodges, gathering to see who the warriors had brought. And then a woman's cry split the air, high and piercing, and a figure broke from the crowd. Running toward them, Ina, Tales whispered, the Lakota word for mother, and she slid from her horse before it had fully stopped, running to meet the woman who clutched her with desperate strength. Both of them weeping and speaking over each other in a torrent of Lakota. Carson dismounted and stood back, feeling suddenly out of place. An intruder in a moment that belonged to family, and Standing Buffalo moved beside him. You did good thing, the warrior said quietly, bringing her home. Many men would not have taken such risk for woman who was not their own people. She deserved to come home, Carson said simply, watching as more people surrounded Tales, touching her to confirm she was real. And an older man pushed through the crowd, his face carved with grief that transformed to joy when he saw his daughter. That is Makpia Luda, Red Cloud, her father, Standing Buffalo explained. He is great warrior, feared by enemies, respected by allies. But see how he weeps like child to have his daughter returned. Carson watched as Red Cloud embraced Tales, lifting her off the ground despite her adult height. And the raw emotion on the older man's face made Carson's chest tight with feelings he couldn't name. Tales eventually extracted herself from the crowd and turned to look for Carson, her eyes searching until she found him standing apart with Standing Buffalo. And she spoke urgently to her father, gesturing toward Carson, explaining something that made Red Cloud's expression grow serious. The older warrior approached Carson with measured steps, his bearing dignified despite the tears still wet on his cheeks. And when he spoke, his English was better than Standing Buffalo's. My daughter tells me you saved her life, that you protected her when she had nothing, that you asked for nothing in return. Red Cloud paused. This is debt that cannot be repaid with horses or blankets or weapons. This is debt of honor. There's no debt, Carson said, meeting the older man's eyes directly. I did what anyone should have done, what I hope someone would do for my daughter if I had one. Red Cloud studied him with an intensity that felt like being examined at a soul-deep level. You are not like other white men we have known, he said finally. My daughter says you have honor, that you treated her with respect, that she was safe in your home. These are not small things. These are everything. Your daughter is remarkable, Carson said honestly. She's strong and brave and kind. You raised her well. Something shifted in Red Cloud's expression. A knowing look that suggested he saw more than Carson was saying. Come, he said. You will eat with my family. You will rest in my lodge, and we will talk more of what happened and what comes next. Carson followed Red Cloud through the camp, aware of curious and suspicious eyes watching his passage. A white man walking among Lakota families, and children ran alongside, chattering questions their parents hushed quickly. Red Cloud's lodge was larger than the others, decorated with painted symbols that Carson assumed represented the warrior's achievements and status. And inside, buffalo robes covered the floor. A fire burned in the center, and Talise sat beside her mother, still holding the older woman's hand as if afraid to let go. Sit, Red Cloud gestured to a place across the fire from Talise. My wife, Wichipee Waste, she does not speak English, but she understands gratitude. She knows what you have done for our daughter. Wichipee Waste looked at Carson with eyes that were Talis's eyes, the same depth and intelligence, and she spoke in Lakota, her voice thick with emotion, and Talise translated. My mother says you have given her greatest gift, the return of her child. She says you are welcome in our family always, and that the spirits will bless you for your kindness. Carson felt heat rise in his face, uncomfortable with such profound gratitude. Please tell your mother I was honored to help Talise, that she made my home less lonely and my life better for knowing her. Talise translated, her voice soft, and her mother's eyes grew bright with new tears. And she rose and moved around the fire, and before Carson could react, she had placed her hands on either side of his face and pressed her forehead to his, a gesture that felt sacred, maternal, accepting. When she released him, Carson found his own eyes burning with unshed tears, overwhelmed by the raw emotional openness of this family that had every reason to hate white men, but chose instead to embrace the one who had brought their daughter home. The evening passed in a blur of food and conversation. Red Cloud asking detailed questions about the men who had taken Talise, their descriptions, their direction of travel. And Carson saw the warrior's face harden as he learned the full extent of what his daughter had endured. These men, if they come to our land seeking her, they will find only death, Red Cloud said flatly. I will spread word to all our warriors, to our allies among the Cheyenne and Arapaho. These traitors will be hunted. They will pay for what they have done. They were heading east when I last heard, Carson offered, looking in the wrong direction, but they seem determined, willing to search a long time. Then they will search until they find their end, Red Cloud said with grim certainty. My daughter is home now, under protection of her people. No white traitor will touch her again. As night deepened, the lodge gradually emptied, relatives and well-wishers departing until only Red Cloud's immediate family remained. And the older warrior rose. You have traveled far, you must rest. I will show you where you will sleep. Carson stood, suddenly reluctant to leave the warm intimacy of the family lodge. And his eyes found Talis's across the fire. And in her expression he saw his own conflict mirrored. The acknowledgement that their time together was ending. That morning would bring decisions neither was ready to face. Thank you for everything, Carson said, speaking to the family but looking at Talise, for welcoming me, for trusting me, for letting me be part of bringing your daughter home. Red Cloud placed a hand on Carson's shoulder. You are not just man who brought her home, he said quietly. You are man who gave her back herself, who reminded her that not all people are cruel, who showed her that safety exists. These gifts are beyond measure. Carson followed Red Cloud to a guest lodge, smaller but comfortable. And the older warrior paused before leaving. My daughter, she speaks of you with great respect, with gratitude, but also with something more, he said carefully. I see this in her eyes, hear it in her voice. This is a complicated thing, yes? Yes, Carson admitted. Very complicated. In the morning, We talk more, Red Cloud said, about future. About what is possible and what is wise. But tonight, you rest, you have earned peace. Alone in the guest lodge, Carson lay on buffalo robes that smelled of sage and smoke. And he stared at the peak of the tipi where smoke from the small fire escaped into the night sky. And he thought about Talise sleeping in her family's lodge, surrounded by love and safety, back where she belonged. And he wondered if belonging was enough, or if what had grown between them in those weeks at the ranch was strong enough to bridge the impossible distance between their worlds. Tomorrow would bring answers, or at least conversations that might lead to answers, but tonight, Carson was content to lie in the darkness and remember the way Talise had looked at him across the fire. The longing and conflict and hope all mingled together in her dark eyes. Sleep came slowly, and with it, dreams of rivers and rescues and a woman who had changed everything simply by letting him save her. Dawn arrived with the sound of camp awakening. Children's laughter mixing with the low voices of women preparing morning meals. And Carson emerged from the guest lodge to find the valley bathed in golden light that made the frost-covered grass shimmer like scattered jewels. He'd slept poorly, his mind churning with questions about what this day would bring. Whether Red Cloud's promised conversation would clarify or complicate the impossible situation he found himself in. Loving a woman who belonged to a world so different from his own. Standing Buffalo appeared carrying 2 tin cups of coffee. An unexpected concession to white customs that made Carson smile. "You sleep well?" the warrior asked, handing him one of the cups. "Well enough," Carson replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Your camp is beautiful, peaceful. I can see why Talise wanted so badly to come home." "Home calls to the heart," Standing Buffalo agreed, settling onto a log near the cold fire pit. "But sometimes heart is divided, wanting 2 things that cannot exist together. This is difficult burden to carry." Carson glanced at the warrior sharply, hearing implications in the carefully chosen words. "You're saying Talise is torn." "I am saying what anyone with eyes can see," Standing Buffalo replied calmly. "She is happy to be home, yes, happy to see family, to sleep in her mother's lodge, to speak her own language. But there is also sadness in her eyes, a looking toward the south as if something she values was left behind." Carson stared into his coffee, unsure how to respond, unsure what acknowledging his own feelings might mean for Talise's future. "She belongs here with her people," he said finally. "Whatever she might feel about me or the time we spent together, this is where she should be." "Should be and want to be are not always same thing," Standing Buffalo observed. "But you are right that her place is complicated. Red Cloud will want to speak with you soon. He has been thinking all night about what is best for his daughter." The conversation was interrupted by children running past, chasing each other in some elaborate game. And Carson watched them with a mixture of longing and melancholy, wondering what his own children might have looked like if Sarah hadn't left. If the war hadn't broken something essential inside him. Talise appeared from her family's lodge, wearing traditional Lakota dress that her mother must have given her, the buckskin decorated with intricate beadwork and quillwork. And she looked so completely at home in Thisteding that Carson felt his heart sink with the realization that she truly did belong here in ways she could never belong in his isolated ranch house. She walked toward him with hesitant steps, her expression guarded, as if she too had spent the night wrestling with impossible questions. "Good morning," she said in English, then repeated it in Lakota for Standing Buffalo's benefit. "Morning," Carson replied, his voice rougher than intended. "You look," he paused, searching for words adequate to describe how beautiful she looked in her traditional dress. How right she seemed in this place. "You look like you're home." Something flickered in Talise's eyes, hurt perhaps, or disappointment at his choice of words. "Yes, I am home," she agreed quietly. "My mother dressed me this morning. Said I must look like proper Lakota woman again, not like white man's." She stopped, leaving the sentence unfinished, not like white man's what? Carson asked gently. Talis's jaw tightened. She did not say. But I know what she was thinking, what everyone is thinking. That I spent weeks alone with white man. That this is shameful thing, even though you were honorable, even though nothing improper happened. There will be talk, questions about my virtue. About whether I can still make good marriage among our people. Carson felt anger rise hot in his chest. That's not fair to you. You were taken, stolen. You survived something terrible, and they're worried about gossip? It is our way, Talai said with resignation. Reputation matters, especially for unmarried women. Especially now when our people face so much pressure from white settlements. We must be stronger, more careful, more protective of our customs. Standing Buffalo rose tactfully. I will leave you to talk, he said. Red Cloud wishes to speak with you both after morning meal. He will send someone to bring you to his lodge. After the warrior departed, Carson and Talis stood in awkward silence. The easy companionship they'd shared at the ranch feeling impossibly distant. As if the journey north had carried them, not just across miles, but across some unbridgeable cultural divide. I don't know what to say, Carson admitted finally. I want you to be happy. Want you to have the life you deserve here with your family. But I also, he stopped. Unwilling to burden her with his own conflicted feelings. You also what? Talais pressed, stepping closer, her dark eyes searching his face. I also don't want to lose you, Carson said. The words escaping before he could stop them. These weeks with you at the ranch. They reminded me what it feels like to not be alone. To have someone who understands. Who sees past the damage to whatever might still be good underneath. And the thought of going back to that empty house. Of returning to solitude after knowing what it's like to share space with you. It feels like losing something precious I only just discovered. Talis's eyes filled with tears that she blinked back furiously. You think this is easy for me? Coming home to family I love, but knowing I must leave behind person who saved me. Who protected me, who made me feel safe for first time since traitors took me. Her voice shook with emotion. My heart is torn in two pieces. One piece belongs here with my people, with my language and my customs, and everything familiar. But other piece, she pressed her hand to her chest. Other piece belongs to lonely Cattleman who lives in house by the prairie and makes terrible coffee and looks at me like I am something precious instead of something broken. Carson reached for her hand without thinking, and she let him take it. Their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. What do we do? He asked quietly. We talk to my father, Talais said. We listen to his wisdom, and then we decide what is possible and what is only dream. The summons came an hour later, a young boy sent to bring them to Red Cloud's lodge. And Carson and Talais walked together through the camp, aware of eyes watching. Of whispered conversations that stopped as they passed. And Carson felt the weight of judgment, even if he couldn't understand the words. Red Cloud waited inside his lodge with Wichipee Waste beside him. And the older couple's faces were serious, carved with the gravity of the conversation ahead. And Red Cloud gestured for Carson and Talais to sit across the fire from them. I have spoken with my wife, Red Cloud began without preamble, and with the elders of our band. We have discussed situation that brings white cattlemen to our camp with our daughter. We have considered what is honorable, what is practical, and what is best for Talis's future. Carson felt his stomach tighten with apprehension, sensing that Red Cloud's formal tone did not bode well for whatever hope he'd been harboring. My daughter tells us you treated her with great respect, Red Cloud continued. That you gave her shelter and food and safety, without demanding anything in return. That you were honorable man when many would not have been, for this. You have our eternal gratitude and our respect. But, Carson supplied, hearing the unspoken word hanging in the air. But our daughter also tells us she has feelings for you, Red Cloud said carefully. Feelings that go beyond gratitude, beyond friendship. And we see in your eyes that you feel same way for her. This creates difficult situation, one that has no easy answer. Talai spoke urgently in Lakota, her voice passionate. And her father listened with patient attention before responding in the same language. And the exchange continued for several minutes while Carson sat helplessly, understanding nothing but reading volumes in their body language and tone. Finally, Red Cloud switched back to English, including Carson in the conversation. My daughter says she wishes to choose her own path, that she is grateful to be home, but also needs time to understand her heart. She asks for permission to remain with you for winter, to see if what she feels is true attachment or only gratitude and relief at being rescued. Carson's heart leaped with desperate hope. But Red Cloud held up his hand, however. This is not decision I can make lightly. If my daughter returns to White Man's Ranch for winter, there will be talk. There will be questions about her honor and her loyalty to our people. And when spring comes, if she wishes to return to us, she may find herself no longer fully accepted. That's not right, Carson protested. She's your daughter, your people's daughter. Nothing she does should change that. You do not understand our ways, Red Cloud said firmly, but not unkindly. We are people under pressure, surrounded by settlers who want our land, soldiers who want our submission, traders who want our resources in such times. We hold more tightly to our customs, judge more harshly those who seem to stray from traditional paths. It is not fair, perhaps, but it is reality. Wichipee Waste spoke for the first time, her voice soft but carrying authority, and Talise translated. My mother says that love should not be bound by fear of judgment, that the spirits brought me to Carson for reason, and that if my heart truly calls me to his world, then I should follow that call even if path is difficult. Red Cloud looked at his wife with an expression of mingled exasperation and deep affection. Your mother has always been more willing to trust the spirits than to worry about practical matters, he said. Then sighed heavily. But perhaps she is right. Perhaps this is a decision that only you can make, Talise. Only you can decide whether your future lies here among your people or out there in the white man's world. I do not want to choose one and lose the other, Talise said, her voice breaking. Why must it be all or nothing? Why can I not have both my family and Carson? Why can love not bridge this divide? Because the world does not work that way, Red Cloud said gently. Because tensions between our peoples grow worse each year. Because loving a white man means stepping outside Lakota society in ways that may be impossible to step back from. I do not say this to hurt you, daughter. I say it so you understand what you risk if you choose this path. Carson had remained silent during this exchange, but now he spoke, his voice heavy with the weight of responsibility. Red Cloud is right, he said, looking directly at Talise. If you come back to the ranch with me, you're giving up everything here. Your family, your people, your place in Lakota society. And I can't ask you to do that. I won't ask you to sacrifice so much for what we have, no matter how much I want it. Talise turned to him with fire in her eyes. You do not ask, I choose, she said fiercely. I choose to come with you, to spend winter at ranch, to see if what we have is strong enough to build life on, and if it is not, then I return in spring and face whatever judgment comes, but I will not let fear decide my future. I will not let other people's expectations steal away chance at happiness. Red Cloud studied his daughter for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You have your mother's stubborn heart, he said. And perhaps her wisdom too, if this is your choice. Made freely and with full understanding of cost. Then I will not stand in your way, but, he added, his voice hardening with paternal authority, you will marry this white man properly, before witnesses, in manner that leaves no question about honor of your relationship. I will not have my daughter living as unmarried woman in man's house, even if that man saved her life. This is not negotiable. Carson felt his breath catch. the conversation having moved so quickly from impossible separation to talk of marriage that he struggled to keep up. "I would be honored to marry Talais," he said carefully. "If that's what she wants, if she's certain this is the path she chooses." Talais looked at him with eyes that held both fear and determination. "I am certain," she said. "I choose you. I choose the life we can build together. And yes, I will marry you, not because my father demands it, but because my heart demands it." Wichipi Waste began to cry softly, and Red Cloud placed his arm around his wife's shoulders. "We knew when our children were born that they might choose paths different from ours," he said quietly. "This is way of the world. Children grow and make their own decisions. And we must love them enough to let them go, even when it breaks our hearts." The remainder of the day passed in a blur of preparation. Red Cloud insisted on a proper ceremony, one that honored both Lakota customs and the realities of a mixed marriage. And the camp buzzed with activity as word spread that Red Cloud's daughter would marry the white cattleman who had brought her home. Some voices spoke in support, praising Talis's courage and Carson's honor, but others muttered disapproval, questioning whether Red Cloud had gone soft, whether he was betraying his people by blessing this union. And Carson heard enough English mixed in with the Lakota to understand that not everyone viewed their marriage as a cause for celebration. Talais seemed unbothered by the criticism, moving through preparations with calm determination. And her mother and aunts dressed her in the finest traditional wedding garments, a white buckskin dress decorated with hundreds of blue and white beads, her hair braided with strips of otter fur and eagle feathers, and when Carson saw her, his breath caught at how stunning she looked. For his part, Carson had little to offer except his cleanest shirt and the silver ring he'd carried since Sarah had returned it years ago. A circle of metal that had once represented a broken promise, but now might symbolize a new beginning. The ceremony took place at sunset. The entire camp gathered in a circle around Red Cloud's lodge, and an elder named Walks with Thunder performed the ritual. Speaking in Lakota while Talais translated quietly for Carson, they stood facing each other with a blanket wrapped around both their shoulders, symbolizing the joining of their lives, and Walks with Thunder spoke of the sacred nature of marriage, of the responsibilities each partner bore to the other, of the importance of maintaining honor and respect even when times grew difficult. Carson repeated vows in halting Lakota that Talais had taught him earlier, promising to protect her, to honor her, to never raise his hand in anger. And Talais spoke her own vows in both Lakota and English, promising to stand beside him, to share his burdens, to build a home where both their cultures could coexist. When Carson slid the silver ring onto Talis's finger, he said quietly, "This ring has a history. It represents a promise that failed once, but I'm hoping with you it can represent a promise that endures. I love you, Talais. I didn't expect to, didn't plan for it, but I do, and I promise to spend the rest of my life proving that love is worth the risk you're taking." Talais looked at the ring through tears. "I love you too," she whispered, "and I am not afraid of the future because we face it together." The ceremony concluded with Red Cloud and Wichipi Waste placing their hands on their daughter's head in blessing. And then the feast began, food and music and dancing that lasted long into the night. And Carson found himself pulled into celebration despite his exhaustion, despite the lingering sadness of knowing they would leave this place in the morning. Red Cloud approached him as the festivities began to wind down. "You take my daughter far from me," the older warrior said. "This is hard thing for father to accept, but I see how she looks at you. I see that she has chosen with her heart as well as her head. So I ask only this, take care of her, protect her, and if she ever wishes to return, to visit, or to stay, you let her come without guilt or recrimination." "I promise," Carson said, meeting the older man's eyes. "I'll take care of her, and she always be free to visit her family, to maintain connection to her people. I won't try to make her into something she's not." "Then you are wiser than most white men," Red Cloud said, "and perhaps this marriage will work after all." They left the camp at dawn, Talais riding beside Carson as they retraced their path south. And the farewell was tearful but not final. Promises to visit in spring. Assurances that love was not diminished by distance. And as they rode away, Talise looked back only once, her expression resolute despite the tears on her cheeks. The journey back to the ranch took 5 days. Traveling slower than they had coming north, stopping to hunt and gather herbs, taking time to simply be together without the pressure of urgent destination. And each night they slept under the stars wrapped in the wedding blanket, and Carson marveled at how natural it felt to have her beside him. When the ranch finally came into view, looking exactly as they'd left it, Carson felt a surge of homecoming so strong it nearly overwhelmed him. "Welcome home," he said to Talise. "Our home now, together." Talise smiled. That full, genuine smile he'd only seen a handful of times. "Yes, our home," she agreed, "where we build our life, where we prove that love is stronger than fear, stronger than judgment, stronger than the things that try to divide us." They settled into married life with surprising ease, Talise bringing her knowledge of medicine and craft to complement Carson's skills with cattle and horses. And they worked side by side through the late autumn, preparing for winter, storing food, repairing structures, creating a home that reflected both their backgrounds. Talise hung herbs from the rafters and painted traditional symbols on the walls with pigments she made from prairie plants. And Carson built her a workbench where she could prepare medicines and craft the items she'd learned to make from her mother. And together they transformed the sparse bachelor dwelling into something warm and lived in and loved. Winter arrived, with heavy snows that isolated them from the outside world for weeks at a time. But Carson found he didn't mind the enforced solitude because he wasn't truly alone anymore. Every morning he woke to Talise's presence. Every evening they sat together by the fire, and the nightmares that had plagued him since the war came less frequently, as if having her beside him kept the darker memories at bay on the longest night of winter, when snow piled high against the cabin walls and wind howled across the frozen prairie. Talise told Carson she was carrying their child, and he pulled her close, feeling gratitude and terror and joy all mingled together. "Are you frightened?" he asked, knowing childbirth was dangerous, especially this isolated from medical help. "No," Talise said with quiet confidence. "My mother taught me well. And I have herbs and knowledge to help when time comes besides." She smiled, placing his hand on her still flat belly. "This child is born from love that crossed impossible divide. Surely the spirits will protect something so precious." Spring came eventually, as it always did, snow melting into rushing streams, grass turning green, and with the thaw came visitors, Red Cloud and Standing Buffalo, and a small party of Lakota who had traveled south to check on Talise, to see if the white cattleman had kept his promises. Red Cloud embraced his daughter carefully, noting her rounded belly with visible emotion. "You carry my grandchild," he said, wonder in his voice. "A child who will walk between two worlds." "Yes," Talise agreed. "A child who will know both languages, both cultures, who will understand that being Lakota and being part of white world are not mutually exclusive, who will prove that love builds bridges where hate builds walls." They spent 3 days with Talise's family, sharing meals and stories and making plans for future visits. And when Red Cloud prepared to depart, he took Carson aside. "I was wrong to doubt you," he said simply. "You have kept your promises. My daughter is happy. She is honored. She is loved. This is all Father can ask." "Thank you," Carson said, "for trusting me with her, for giving your blessing even when it was difficult. I'll spend my life earning that trust." As the Lakota party rode north, Talise stood beside Carson watching until they disappeared over the horizon, and he felt her hand slip into his. "Are you sad?" he asked. "A little," she admitted, "but also happy because I know they will return, and we will visit them. And our child will know grandparents and cousins, and the stories of the Lakota people. We have not lost my family. We have simply expanded what family means." Summer brought the baby, a daughter with Carson's light eyes and Talise's dark hair, and they named her Hope, because that was what she represented. Hope that different worlds could merge, that love could overcome prejudice, that the future might be kinder than the past. Carson held his daughter in his arms while Tally slept, exhausted from labor, and he whispered promises to the tiny life he'd helped create. "I'll teach you to be strong," he said softly, "to be kind, to judge people by their character rather than their appearance, to build bridges instead of walls. And if the world doesn't understand what you are, if people judge you for being both white and Lakota, you remember that you come from love. And love is the strongest force there is." Years passed, and the ranch prospered. Carson's herd grew. Tallis's reputation as healer spread to neighboring ranches, and their family expanded with 2 more children. A son they named River after the water that had brought them together, and another daughter called Morning Star after Tallis's mother. They faced challenges, certainly, prejudice from some white neighbors who disapproved of mixed marriage, tension when conflicts between settlers and tribes escalated, difficult conversations about which world their children truly belonged to. But through it all, they held to the foundation they'd built: trust and respect and the deep love that had survived impossible odds. On their 10th anniversary, Carson and Tallies rode out to the Missouri River, standing at the place where he'd pulled her from the churning water all those years ago, and the river flowed calm and steady, bearing no resemblance to the angry torrent that had nearly claimed her life. "Do you ever regret it?" Carson asked, "choosing me, leaving your people's camp, the life you might have had if you'd stayed?" Talise turned to him with a smile that had only deepened over the years, becoming richer with shared experience and earned joy. "I regret nothing," she said firmly. "The river brought me to you. We built something beautiful from tragedy. We created family where there was loneliness. We proved that love transcends the boundaries people try to impose. How could I regret any of that?" Carson pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of sage and smoke that always clung to her hair. "I love you," he said, "more now than the day we married. More every day we spend together. You saved me just as much as I saved you." "Then we saved each other," Tallis replied, "and we will keep saving each other. Every day, for as long as we both live." They stood together by the river as the sun set. 2 people from different worlds who had built a bridge between them, and in that moment, with purple light painting the prairie and the river whispering its eternal song, they understood that some rescues happen in an instant while others take a lifetime. And both are equally precious, equally worth the risk.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.